Hey there, this is Chris and Eli from Landlord Gurus. We are talking today about credit scores. We got a question from one of our subscribers, and he asked whether there was a good guide in terms of what credit scores we should accept or he should accept when looking for a new tenant. I think he'd initially set it pretty high, like over 700, and was having a hard time finding tenants, and he reached out and asked what we generally set ours at, and whether credit score was a good indication of the ability for a renter to pay rent or not. So those are all good questions, and we figured we would take the time and answer them here on this video. So first, the first question is, what do we generally set our credit scores at when we screen? And I told him that I usually set between 620 and 650. Sort of depends on the property, the location, what sort of tenants I'm attracting or looking to attract. So all those things in my mind uh, have an impact on what I end up setting the credit score requirement at. But yeah, generally it's 620 to 650. Eli, you around the same?
Usually more 640, 650. Yeah. I think I default to 640, but I will in some cases set higher. I set 700 actually for a single family home that I rent out, which is definitely a higher dollar price point. And I'm just looking for somebody who I have even that much more confidence in, that they have established themselves financially and have built up some credit and have a track record where they've been paying their bills, and I can take that hopefully as a sign that they will pay their rent as well. So, like you said, it depends on the
Yeah,
property.
yeah, okay. And in terms of a rough guide, so I guess I've seen TransUnion where they kind of have a guide that based on certain ranges for their credit scores or their renter scores. From
Mm.
let's say anything under 520 means something. If it's 520 to 640, 640 to 720, or 720 and higher. So I sent that to him as well, and we can kind of run down what the different ranges mean according to TransUnion. In terms of they're looking at it from whether that tenant is a potential risk of missing payments or having late payments or not. So
And this is, sorry to interrupt, Chris. This is something that TransUnion has developed specifically for landlords who are screening tenants, correct? Is this associated with their resident score, which is what most of us, I think, look at when we get a TransUnion report?
yeah,
And it's for those who haven't dug into it, the TransUnion at least, and I think maybe some of the other bureaus have different types of reports for different purposes. So buying a house is different than renting a house. So TransUnion is pretty dominant. Most of the screening services out there use TransUnion in the background. So, and they deliver what they call a resident score, and I think that's what this is referring to.
yeah, that's true. It's what they call their resident score. So I think they probably look at a couple different factors than they would for a general credit score, but it's
Mm.
very similar in terms of the score ranges, right? From I think the minimum is 350 and it goes up to what, over 800.
Eight, yeah, 850 maybe, and then one of them goes to 850. Used to be like everything. There's inflation. Used to be 800 was the absolute max, I think, but it's gone up.
Yeah. So how they do it is that anything under 520 they indicate with like a red light, like a traffic signal, which they say is a warning, and they say that this usually means the applicant is likely defaulted on loans, sometimes from multiple lenders, or they've gone through bankruptcy in the past 7 to 10 years. And so, therefore, you're at a significant risk of late or missed rent payments if you accept someone here.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think for me, I wouldn't look at anything. Definitely wouldn't look at anything under 520 there.
Yeah,
Yeah. Then they have
I wouldn't either.
520 to 640, which they use a yellow light as in caution. And these are considered slightly risky. They've probably faced some sort of financial difficulty or hardship in the past. And there's a high chance of later missed rent payments here, but you might want to look at the mitigating factors and better understand the risk. So, I've had applicants in this range. Like I said, I can go down to, for some places, as low as 620. So I've had some applicants in here before. And yeah, it's definitely worth looking into why their scores might be in that range. Could be medical debt that they had a hard time paying off, or it could be, something that happened in the past, a couple of late payments, even if it was 5, 7 years
Before,
ago and they're younger, things like that.
right. Life events do have an impact on this type of thing.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah. And when you're done, Chris, we should talk about just kind of like what piece of the overall selection process is this number? How do we use it as a part of our selection
Yeah.
process?
Okay. Yeah. So we'll finish off the ranges and we'll get back to that. So the next step up is 640 to 720, which TransUnion indicates as good with a light green. And this is considered good, and your risk of late or missed rent drops considerably. However, you should still look at other aspects of their screening report and rental history to fully assess your risk.
Mm.
And then the 720 and higher, excellent. You have a green light. Green lights, green means go. So people with scores here generally have a history of being responsible in most of their financial decisions, and they've made most, if not all, of their payments on time, and probably carry a relatively low credit card balance compared to their limits, and the risk of missed payments here is low. So, yeah, I mean, when you get a tenant with a score above 720, I think you're, as far as, late or missed rent payments, it's probably a very low risk. But again, it's
Yeah.
not a be all end all. So, as you were saying, Eli, there's what part of the whole tenant screening process do we look at? Credit scores and residents.
Yeah. And for me, it changed. With my first rental, we had some tenants that had terrible credit. I don't remember what the numbers were, but there were defaults and maybe even a bankruptcy within a few years prior to them applying. And we met them, we liked them. This is my wife and I were busy there, fixing this place up. And it was in a kind of an up and coming area. So, and it was also a basement unit. So a lower dollar unit, not a fancy neighborhood. So we knew we weren't going to be commanding, CEO, level, income and credit. But we essentially just decided that that part didn't matter to us and we rented to them anyway. Now, I mean, I wouldn't do that today, but one of the main reasons I wouldn't do that today is because Washington now, and Seattle in particular, has passed so many rules that, and one of them being in Seattle, that you have to post your criteria and you have to have specific criteria that's all written out of what it takes to be accepted as an applicant. And anybody who meets that, you're required to accept their tenancy. So there's no like, you don't really meet the credit score, but you were really respectful and why the reason this happened. It was clear. I know, you have to kind of pin things down and then follow it. So that's the biggest one. But I've also just gotten a little more cautious over the years. So
Yeah, and again, I think that again, credit score's not kind of the end all be all of whether they're gonna be a good tenant or whether they're gonna make their payments or miss their payments, but it can be an indicator. If they have a history of not paying their bills, which would show up in a credit score, right? If they run up a lot of credit card debt and they don't pay on time consistently, then
right,
that's often an indicator of how they are going to look at the rent payments as well. So if
yeah,
it can be a good judge in terms of that, like you can see how they are doing and kind of make some assumptions, but they are assumptions because like you said, Eli, some tenants have good credit scores and still don't pay their rent. Some tenants don't have good credit
yeah.
scores and are great about paying their rent. So again, we look at other factors like income to rent ratio, how long they've had their job and whether they are a good employee, get their employer references, to see whether they
Always
are,
check references.
yeah, exactly, to see whether they are at risk, what their history is like, things like that.
And, and I set some in my criteria. I set some kind of guidelines around that. Like even if their score is high enough, I will say that there have to be no current delinquencies and no more than three missed payments over the last, or late payments over the last 3 years, so that I'm I'm kind of pointing to things that I think matter, specific things that I think are a factor. And then, Chris, what do you do if somebody doesn't have your required credit score? Is that just a rejection, or do you have
Well,
any
based on
wiggle
the,
room or mechanism?
I mean, based on the current rules here in Seattle, right? If I set on my criteria that they've got to have a minimum of 620 and they don't meet that 620, then, if another applicant comes along and
Yeah.
does meet that criteria, then I go with the one who meets that criteria. I think the rules are if you get no applicants, I guess, or no one can meet the criteria, you can always lower your criteria and then repost that and then, rent to the first one who does meet the criteria. But no, I mean, that's why I keep mine relatively, I wouldn't say that my credit scores are super high. The criteria at 620 to 650 is not
Yeah.
super high. So I don't think I'm missing out on anyone who might otherwise have the ability and the wherewithal to make all their payments on time.
Yeah. I agree. It's a balancing act.
Right.
Where do I think that is good enough that isn't going to eliminate a lot of people or people that I might otherwise want to
Exactly.
rent to? So, I asked about what you do when somebody doesn't have the credit score, and I write into my criteria that if an applicant doesn't meet the financial criteria, that could be an income requirement, which is I use 2.5 times the rent as my threshold. And we've written and talked about debt to income ratios as well. Chris, I think at times you've used a 20% debt to income ratio, right?
Right.
And that's the no more than 20% of the income can be kind of claimed by existing debt, right?
Right.
So I like that actually. I next time I go back and revisit my criteria, I may put that in there. I'm not doing it currently, but what I was starting to say is that I state in my criteria that I will consider a cosigner or a guarantor, and that person has to meet all of my criteria. So they have to have the credit score and the income, above and beyond their own to pay for this person's rent, on top of all their own expenses. And that's a little hard to pin down because I don't know what their lifestyle is like. But generally, I'm looking for somebody who's pretty established.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if they have a mortgage, you can see their monthly payments, and if they're, like you said,
Yeah,
subtracting their mortgage payment or their current rent payment from their income, they still have to meet that 2.5 to rent or 3, whatever your criteria is.
right.
So,
Right, and that's a good point. I treat them as an applicant. They go through the same application and credit reports. So I do get that same information of what all of their debt burden is. So I do have a pretty good sense of
yeah,
that, actually.
exactly.
And I'm using Turbo Tenant, which is one of our partners and a great property management software tool. They actually allow you to designate an applicant as a guarantor. So, do you want to add somebody to this lease? I think is kind of the prompt, and then you can say as a roommate or as a guarantor.
Exactly.
And I've done it before. It takes what otherwise is kind of an unwieldy process and makes it a little smoother, and it also documents everything, they're then documented on the lease
Right.
uh, as a code.
Right. And you maintain a copy of their application and all that as well. So it's good to have.
Exactly. Yep. Yep. All right. What else is there to say about
Well, I think that
credit scores?
I think that it's a good place to wrap up. I was going to say that we have recently launched a course, Landlording A to Z. It's an online course, and we talk about things like credit scores, and we talk about tenant screening, as well as all kinds of other things related to the process of being a landlord and renting out property, from rent collection to signing leases and tenant communication, things like that. So we'd encourage you to check that out. You can learn, whether you're a new landlord or someone who's been doing this for a while but just wants to pick up a few more tips and best practices. It's a good place to start. We encourage you to check it out.
And I was just going to reiterate that what we did in creating this course is to sit down and break out the way we look at each of the tasks or challenges or duties of being a landlord, managing your own rental property. And then we went through and gave you a guideline for how to do each of those things, give you our experience and tips and the things that we found that work well. So, like Chris said, whether you're just starting out or if you've been doing it a long time, it's kind of all there. We feel that it's a good, kind of make sure all your practices are in order, and we'd love feedback too. So if you have questions or comments, let us know, and we hope you'll check it out.
Yeah, and again, thanks to our audience member who submitted this question. If anybody else has any other questions, feel free to send them along and we can talk about them here as well. So thanks a lot. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching.